Thanks, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Professor Anton Fedyashin, Philip Brenner's much less distinguished colleague. I am at the history department here at American University. I am Russian by background. And I teach Russian and Soviet history here, and I also run the Carmel Institute of Russian Culture and History, and I wanted to show you the website of the Institute. And I'd like to speak about the importance of cultural diplomacy from the point of view of specifically what we do through the Institute, because I think demonstrating how education contributes to this very important aspect of human relations is as good as philosophizing about it. The Carmel Institute of Russian Culture and History started out as the Initiative for Russian Culture, and it was established at American University about 6 years ago by a private American donor, Susan Carmel Lehrman. You'll see her in the video, and I hope we'll have the sound here. And we have been, this is our 6th year in existence, and our program was created in order to pique the interest of American students in all things Russian, but also to allow American students to experience Russia directly for themselves and to help Russian students come over to the United States. We fundamentally pursue an educational mission, a mission of direct human engagement through systems of education. And I guess if there were a formula that would encompass the outlook and the goal of the Institute, it is to allow American students to see Russia with their own eyes and experience it directly. As with Cuba, for example, and I'm glad I'm coming after Professor Brenner here, there is more information out there that Americans absorb, and I think that goes for all members of our race on this planet. Then there is information that is directly absorbed through experience, either with human beings or of a place. So our institute was created in order to facilitate this kind of direct exchange. Now, cultural diplomacy and educational exchange is, as I like to say it, horticultural business. It's like tending to a garden. You almost never see the results immediately, and it is a long-term process. It's an investment in the future. It is not like banking or making things out of materials. So it takes patience, and it takes perseverance, and we've been lucky enough with our donor and the members of our board that we've put together a team that is committed to this. What we have discovered, however, over the past 6 years is something that's not really a mystery to anyone who teaches in the Russian language or history or literature in the United States, and that's the genuine thirst of Americans to get to know Russia better. I never cease to be amazed by how many of my college students end up getting into Russia, so to speak, through the works of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, not through politics, but through literature, first and foremost, from the best known names. And then from there, the love affair begins with all of the details. Now, we're currently in a situation where there's a crisis in relations, and that brings me to 2 points. One, as much as I hate to admit it, crises stimulate interest. So in American University, and as I hear from my colleagues in other universities, enrollments in Russian history, Russian language, and even literature are going through the roof because everyone's interested to find out the background. But in the end, this unfortunate cause for a very fortunate effect actually creates the atmosphere, the conditions for exposing human beings to each other. And so we've done our best to take advantage of it to a certain extent. We've been around for 6 years. And we have hosted just under 25,000 students and guests at our events. And you'll see in a second in the video what we do. Among other things, film screenings have been very important. We've had 34 of them over the past 6 years. We hold them either at the Russian Embassy here in Washington, D.C. We've held them at the Wilson Center. We've held them at the Library of Congress, and we've partnered with other organizations. Film happens to be a very good way for people to absorb culture visually through the ear, and it also happens to help students who are studying Russian, because hearing the language with subtitles is a very useful way of studying it. every year we hold a symposium dedicated to exploring the positive sides of the U.S.-Russian relations. And over the past years, we started in 2012 with a symposium dedicated to overcoming Cold War stereotypes. In 2013, we held a symposium called The Strength of Dialogue, celebrating the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's commencement address here at American University in June of 1963, after the Cuban Missile Crisis sobered everyone up. And all of a sudden, both Kennedy and Khrushchev started speaking about each other and each other's societies and countries in a much more favorable way. We did in 2014 a symposium called Ending the Cold War, the Reagan-Gorbachev experience, with people who spoke at it who had been members either of Gorbachev's or of Reagan's administration. In 2015, we did a symposium dedicated to the lessons of the Grand Alliance during the Second World War. That, of course, was an anniversary. The year after, in 2016, we did a symposium at the National Air and Space Museum dedicated to U.S., Russian, and international cooperation on the International Space Station, the ISS. Last year, we also did a symposium dedicated to the book of James Billington, who is the former Librarian of Congress and a great Russian scholar. He's now emeritus. We have a new Librarian of Congress here. James Billington, his book, The Icon and the Axe, came out in 1966 and is still one of the best cultural histories of Russia written in the English language. And so in between the symposia and the film screenings, we also have concerts of Russian musicians who come over to the United States. So the head of the Mariinsky Orchestra, Valery Gergiev, has spoken at our events. Denis Matsuev, the pianist, has performed. Igor Butman, the jazz saxophonist, together with Wynton Marsalis, who, of course, is one of the best and most famous trumpet players, both jazz and classical, and the head of the Lincoln Jazz Orchestra, have performed at our events. And in the process of working on our programs, we've partnered with the Library of Congress, with the Russian Embassy, with the Dave Brubeck Foundation, the National Geographic Society, the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian, and many other organizations in Washington. This is one of the blessings of teaching and working in Washington, D.C., is that there are so many headquarters, so many embassies here, so many institutions of a global caliber, that there's really an enormous amount of places to choose from. And there is such a thing as a consortium of Washington, D.C. universities. 14 schools go into it, from Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. And to each one of our events, we bus students for free. Even more importantly, we bus them back for free. So this has helped us with numbers, in addition to stimulating interest in the events. If there is a philosophy behind the Carmel Institute, it is fairly simple. The Institute was established with the idea that constructive international relations have to be based on mutual respect and mutual understanding. And before these kids get out into the so-called real world, which incidentally is no more real than the one we live in, it is the perfect time to capture their imaginations and to stimulate their creativity, as well as their propensity for dialogue. And that goes especially for engaging with people from other nationalities. I went to college and graduate school in the 1990s, and I remember very well when I was doing my MA in Eastern European, Central Asian, Eurasian Studies, that in the late 1990s, there was a very specific attitude in the West, affected by the euphoria of the Cold War, which was revolved, let me put it this way, around the assumption of convergence of all societies to a Western standard, which at the same time was very vaguely defined. And B, there was a tendency to speak about Russia specifically, but you could apply this to many other countries, in terms of what it was not in terms of what it should become, and very rarely in terms of what it actually was. And this attitude you can actually still see in the way that at least the Western mainstream media speaks of a lot of non-Western societies to this day. The Institute, in part, attempts to overcome this assumption of convergence and, following specific models, in the sense that it explores culture. We don't deal with political questions. We deal with cultural issues. But that's precisely because we define culture as a concentrated expression of a nation's, or a people's, if you want, personality. And one that you cannot reason away, one that is impossible to moralize about, but one that you have to engage, do your best to attempt to understand, and thereby get a grip on the... Oh, I got it up. Yeah, it's just, it needs to, there we go, to project. To get a grip of a society with which you are dealing. Now, for those of you who have lived or have taught or got an education in the United States, it will come as no surprise that Americans have a tendency to be very practical and pragmatic, and our students here at American University are no exception. As a matter of fact, being in Washington, D.C. is particularly encouraging of thinking globally and wanting to get involved. AU School of International Service is, by the way, the biggest such institution in the United States. However, our attitude, in a sense, is that before American students go out to engage the world, they need to understand its complexity and its subtleties. And that comes through culture, as well as, of course, learning the history and the politics, the political makeup of different places. So over the past 6 years, in addition to the events that we hold, which are created to stimulate interest, in our case in Russia, the Carmel Institute has also handed out grants to American students to go and study in Russia during the summers. We've given grants for Russian students to come and study in the United States. Over the past 3 years ago, we established a direct student exchange agreement with the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, which is considered to be the best diplomatic academy in Russia, as well as the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. So we now have students going back and forth from AU to Russia and from Russia to Washington. We're looking to expand these links. And in the process of working on these educational agreements, we found a remarkable thing, that the Russians are eager, exceptionally eager, to establish direct links with American universities and have professors teach on an exchange basis, as well as students to travel back and forth. The educational systems are very different, as they are between different countries, and that in itself is a whole process. In the U.S., there's a whole industry dedicated to conducting exchanges, which has also been our experience. And last but not least, every summer, I lead a class trip to Russia, which is themed in different ways. So we started the Institute in 2012, and the first trip was called Dostoevsky's Russia. So I took students to Moscow and then St. Petersburg. They read Crime and Punishment, which is a novel that is so detailed in its descriptions of St. Petersburg that you can literally walk the book because Dostoevsky has his characters count their steps on several occasions. So we did all of that, and I've discovered that it is amazing how surprised many American students are between the image of the Russia that they get from the mainstream media over here and what they actually see when they hit the ground and they experience the smell, the taste, the Russians themselves, when they travel between the cities and look at everything through their own eyes. So in 2013, we did a trip called Romanov Russia. It was for the 400th anniversary of the dynasty. We've done literary Russia, musical Russia. This coming summer, because of the World Cup taking place there, I decided to make the human figure the center of the theme. So we'll be exploring the human figure as it's been portrayed from iconography all the way to modernity and to sports. So that's the kind of activity that we do here, and we have found out several things. When you approach the Russians with the attitude that you are willing to cooperate and to learn together and work towards shared goals, the reaction has been nothing but overwhelmingly positive. They are eager to establish direct relations with American universities and institutions of higher learning, and have gone out of their way to cut through the red tape on their side in order to get the student exchange agreements settled, which we've been very happy about. Number two, it's amazing how students' perceptions change when they actually travel to the country that they are studying. Because what you read in books and what you see in TV, let alone in movies, often is at great odds with the reality on the ground. And it's always interesting for me to hear the kids' reactions after I meet them back here in Washington, D.C. Last but not least, the discovery is a lesson that is, I don't know, at least 3,000 years old, which is that mutual respect is the kind of foundation upon which a lot can actually be built. Direct dialogue, mutual respect in the sense of understanding and acceptance. I don't really even like the word tolerance, not because there's anything wrong with the concept, but because the very verb to tolerate seems to imply to me, and this is strictly my personal opinion, some form of disagreement with something, but a willingness to tolerate it. I think understanding is a much better term. Again, this is my personal opinion, because to accept others as they are, not as they should be or as they are not, but are expected to become, but as they are, seems to be the basis for understanding. Now, we are going through a very rough patch in U.S.-Russian relations. That's not a mystery to anyone on this planet today. But sooner or later, this period will be overcome. We've been in very bad situations before. I'm a child of the Cold War. I remember the very early 1980s particularly well, although I was a kid at the time. And before a dialogue restarts, in order not to have to reinvent the wheel, you better invest in a generation that's going to take over power and will already have the links established in order to continue the dialogue. I want to stress specifically this importance of not having to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch, from a tabula rasa, but already having those links through educational exchanges, through cultural events, so on and so forth. So I'll end my very brief, blissfully brief, I may add, remarks here. And let's see, we have a very short video about the activities of our institute that I'm hoping the sound will work. And I wanted to show you, to give you an idea of what we do here in Washington, D.C. and how it works. And it does work. Magnificent.
Russian culture's uniqueness has been described by one of the great Russian critics of the past century, 20th century, is a culture of explosions. And indeed, the history of Russia, I think, can be understood through their successive, almost explosive creativity that developed out of art forms in each of the great periods of Russian history.
I first met Ambassador Kislyak almost 3 years ago when I asked him to host the opera ball for the Washington National Opera. The ambassador and I discussed his vision of enhancing greater cultural relations between Russians and Americans, particularly among younger generations.
We have been discussing the idea of creating a channel of, or rather a vehicle for the students and the younger generation of Americans to learn more about Russia, about what it is and what it is not. And maybe the best way to do it is through the eyes of the Russians themselves.
This is, simply put, a vitally important mission with a direct impact on the national security of the United States. We're all accustomed to speak of that special relationship that exists between Great Britain and the United States. But I would argue that the relationship between the United States and Russia is of greater global significance than that of any other two nations on Earth.
What we are trying to do with the IRC is to expose American students to Russia as a cultural superpower.
I don't know if my eyes are more tired than my feet, but there's so much to see and do. It's been great the entire time.
I would like to thank the management of American University and the Russian Embassy for the excellent arrangements made for this important, interesting, and in my opinion, highly well-timed initiative.
I think the greatest value of the IRC program is that it gets American students really enthusiastic about studying Russian language, Russian culture. It makes them want to go over there, and it also provides funding for students to have the opportunity to go over and improve their knowledge of the language.
I cherish the memory of the warmth of the Russian people, most of all, and their pride and hospitality, and the sense that after such an event, we could never go back to the bad old days. All this made me feel that I was in the midst of a profound, indeed revolutionary chapter in the history of Russian-American relations.
Besides our many successes together aboard the station, the partnership between the United States and Russia has been long and productive. From the Apollo-Soyuz test project to the Shuttle Mir program, together our nations have tested the boundaries of human experience and enabled our astronauts and cosmonauts to take on new challenges on behalf of the entire human race. My good friend and fellow shuttle crewmate, Sergei Krikalev, is here tonight, and our experience as crewmates and now lifelong friends is emblematic of the ways that space exploration can build collaborative and meaningful relationships among nations.
I think for me, it's not only spaceflight experience, it's also experience of communication, experience of building friendship and trust, and the feeling being able to rely on each other.
Я поздравляю вас, дорогие друзья. Поздравляю с этим событием. Как участников, как коллег, с которыми мы решаем общечеловеческие проблемы, связанные с освоением космоса.
The mighty American culture, the mighty Russian culture are absolutely, I think, destined to go on like this.
That's Denis Matsuev, one of the most famous pianists today, Russian, with groups. That's it for me. I'll be happy, if we have time, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Yes, let's first thanks to the professor for a very inspiring words, and we do have a time for, let's say, 2 questions. Do we have a candidate?
I'll be very brief in answering them.
Thanks, Professor. I'm Isaq Atmar from Afghanistan. You know, Afghanistan is a country very close to Russia, and also we have a long, long history together with Russia. I'm not a pessimistic person, but I'm also with you that the culture will bring the people together. But do we really think that do the politicians allowed us to be together or not? Since the Cold War, we are seeing this competition is going on between these superpowers. This is not in our hand. We are agreed that the cultural diplomacy will bring people from all over the world together. But do we believe that we are going in the right way, or do the politicians don't allow the people to come together? For example, if you see the competition between the superpowers, still the war is going on in Middle East, in Afghanistan, in different countries. Thank you.
Thanks. Listen, let me put it this way. I wouldn't expect cultural diplomacy to solve all of the world's problems. I see it as a second track endeavor that has to be maintained for the sake of the possibility of dialogue. I think it is unreasonable to expect it to change the world immediately, and if you have that expectation, you will be repeatedly disappointed, and that runs the risk of discouraging people. So we see what we do as a separate track that parallels what happens in the political world, and we simply do our best and focus on our area of responsibility. And, you know, there's the political, the military, the economic tracks. Those are sui generis, unfortunately. If there's overlap, as with the world of science, for example, fantastic, in space exploration. I think there are ways to reach out into the culture of economics and even politics. So the sky's the limit. So it's just a question of, guess what, finances. So, and that's ultimately what determines the success of these programs.
Thank you once again. It's not just a question of financing, I would say, but referring to previous beautiful presentation, which is very much complementary to what you are saying, it's also a question of empathy. Definitely. And if I may be a little bit personal again, and I'm very pleased to see that you put the photo, an example of a great friend of mine, Valery Gergiev, who is one of the leading, not just opera conductor, but really one of the leading musicians in the world, and who is indeed big promoter of Russian culture. But he is, in the same time, citizen of the world. You could see on the photo, he's a director of London Symphony Orchestra. He's a main principal director of Metropolitan Opera. But how, unfortunately, our narrow political approach, and not just among the politicians, because politicians is there to do that, that is their job, but among the people, when we are sometimes way too partisan, looking from our own perspective, how that prevents us to see the broader picture. Let me say something which is a bad example of cultural diplomacy, something against the cultural diplomacy, and it happened at Metropolitan, one of the greatest world cultural institutions, a couple of years ago, when at the opening of the season, there was Valery Gergiev conducting Onegin, great opera by Tchaikovsky with Anya Netrebko, great Russian star. So it was at the Metropolitan Opera, and that Russian conductor is conducting, it is opening of the season, conducting American anthem at the beginning. Everybody is standing, and now he is about to start to conduct the opera. In that moment, the organized group of protesters who bought the ticket, entered into Metropolitan, not very cheap tickets, started the protest. And they didn't prevent, but they certainly influenced, and that was really cultural scandal, which I'm saying, in a way, putting into presentation that we heard before, when we have a narrow approach in our mind, I mean, of course, that we have all, and we should have all totally different political positions. We can have different political positions about the relations of any countries in the world, certainly United States and Russia, but they couldn't and shouldn't prevent us to have empathy when it comes to understanding the other people. And I think that is the role of cultural diplomacy. Sorry for being a little bit long. Once again, thank you, Anton, for that great presentation.